Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's professional lunch at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley, first Vice President of the club, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, who is Ambassador Robert Orr, former ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. Although he's a former ambassador, he is entitled still to the title ambassador because he was confirmed as ambassador to the ADB by the US Senate, and anyone who has that distinction apparently is entitled to continue calling themselves ambassador, so he is absolutely ambassador. It's difficult to know whether to describe him as a businessman turned diplomat or a diplomat come business executive, but I think either way he qualifies. Ambassador Orr had a long and varied career during which he occupied positions as diverse as President of Boeing Japan and Vice President of Motorola Europe and Japan, while also having served as US Ambassador to the ADB in Manila from 2010 to 2016. During his period as ambassador to the ADB, he attained the distinction of becoming the first American to occupy the position of Dean of the ADB board. And he's currently a board member of the Council of American Ambassadors, which is a body consisting of former non-career ambassadors. By the way, he's the only ambassador, or the only delegate to the ADB who actually has the title of ambassador. Everyone else has a more modest title, and there are reasons for that connected with the founding of the ADB, but I won't go into that. I'll leave the ambassador to explain that. Today he's going to talk to us about President Donald Trump's foreign policy in Asia, which of course is of great interest at the present time because of Mr. Trump's recent visit to this region, which incidentally insisted on calling President Trump insisted on calling the Indo-Pacific region rather than the Asia-Pacific region. You may want to ask questions to Ambassador Orr about what that signifies. Ambassador Orr was recently at the APEC, Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum meeting in Vietnam, which was attended by 21 Asia-Pacific leaders. So that too will add context to his comments today. I could go on describing his many achievements as an academic and in business, but instead I think I'll hand the floor to him so that you can benefit from his wide knowledge and experience rather than listening to me. So please join me in welcoming today's guests. And also, if you have a Keitai, please switch it to manner mode or switch it off as a courtesy to our guests. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thanks very much. Right. Well, it's good to be back. I was just thinking today, the last time I had the honor of speaking at the FCCJ was a couple days after Barack Obama was elected president. And I was on a panel there that included, Tanaka Hitoshi, who's a former deputy foreign minister, and but that was the last time, and I was a member of the FCCJ for some time, and an associate member. But when I was posted in Manila, I just sort of decided I couldn't afford the monthly bill. So I said, it's not like being in the corporate world where they would take care of it. The U.S. government doesn't do much for you, I can tell you, when it comes to that. Let me say something about my affiliation. I want to make it clear that I am a member of the board of the Council of American Ambassadors, and it is, as Anthony mentioned, it's an organization of former non-career or former political appointee ambassadors. So we've got about 200 members, and we're based in Washington, D.C. And I want to make clear that anything I say today does not reflect the Council of American Ambassadors. We're a bipartisan group, and not everybody will necessarily share my views, but I will tell you this, a lot do. So I wanted to make that clear. I also want to tie together President Trump's visit to Asia with some serious issues that exist today in the foreign policy community of the United States. And I'm sure some of you have heard about it, and I'm going to get a little bit more detail. But it relates to the fact that the American foreign policy community, particularly in the State Department, is essentially being hollowed out. And this will, and I'm worried about its effect upon the conduct of American foreign policy in this region, because this region is so important to U.S. interests and all of our friends and neighbors around. So I'm going to really talk in two parts. A little bit about Trump's visit. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I figured we can flesh that out in any Q&A. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. State Department, in particular, but not exclusively. I think many of us who followed the campaign, and a little disclaimer here, I want to make it clear, I was involved in the campaign, but for the defeated nominee for Hillary Clinton. So I was an Obama appointee. I was a political appointee of Barack Obama for almost 6 years. And I left the administration in January of last year. Gosh, it's only last year. It seems like a decade. But last year, in January, I left President Obama to go help Secretary Clinton on the campaign. So I want to make that clear. I'm not exactly a nonpartisan figure up here, but I'm only going to give you the best analysis that I see and try to be, obviously fair about it, looking at it. I think we all had indications during the campaign that President Trump now, had a very specific base that he wanted to bring together, that he felt and his team would be sufficient to carry the day to win the election, and a solid base. And I could go into some of the mistakes that Secretary Clinton had and whatnot, but that's not really the topic of my presentation today. So we understood that President Trump had a perspective on foreign policy that was much more unilateral than we have had a tradition of in the United States since the end of World War II. And he has articulated that on numerous occasions. And it comes out in the term America First. And then when we were at APEC, he made that comment more than one occasion, America First. And it really downplaying multilateralism as not being where he feels that American foreign policy is best being conducted. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, but that is something we were able to pick up on as early as the campaign. So I think that this trip, in terms of U.S. policy in Asia, has been the biggest backslide for U.S. interest in 70 years. Because the foundation of American foreign policy in the post-World War II period has been multilateralism of any kind. It's been with NATO in Europe. It's been the previous administration pushed the TPP, et cetera. I think the other thing that we've seen, and where regional leaders have been able to pick up on very quickly, is that they've been able to effectively manipulate President Trump's rather amazing ego. And they have been playing that. They have played him, I think, throughout the visit. I think that Prime Minister Abe has played it pretty effectively. And he picks up on that. Trump picks up on that. Recently, there's a new book out about the Bushes, father and son. And this came out maybe a week ago. And Bush 41 is no fan of President Trump, I can tell you that. And he referred to his lack of humility as a tremendous weakness in his ability to conduct foreign policy. Now, admittedly, I'm a Democrat. I actually served in the Reagan administration as well, so I know both sides. And that's quite a statement from President Bush, whose conduct of foreign policy, I think, has been underrated and will not be going forward because of the things that happened. So the policy or of America First, the way that gets translated to many of the countries in the region is basically every man for himself. And that tremendously undermines the multilateral structure of the environment. So it's every man for himself, and has negated the post-war multilateral institutions. It's allowed, by undermining the multilateral institutions, it allows another rising power in the region, namely China, to proceed in identifying its own objectives in terms of foreign policy. And surprisingly, it sounds a little bit like the United States before. It's ironic. In fact, one of the things that struck me about APEC, this is my 4th APEC meeting. It was the first time I ever saw another country's leader be designated more time than the President of the United States. Xi had more time than the President of the United States. That was first. And it said something to me about where the region thought it could identify some of its best priorities. So in many ways, the drop in the multilateralism by the United States reinforces, I think, Chinese foreign policy in terms of the creation of the AIIB, which is many see as a rival to the ADB, and the One Road, One Belt policy, which is a variety of interpretation, but some have said it's the most forward-leaning foreign aid, foreign policy package since the Marshall Plan, and 3 or 4 times larger, even in today's dollar terms. So that's a change. Conceptually, for example, the AIIB makes a lot of sense because the infrastructure demand in Asia cannot be satisfied by any of the multilateral banks. It just can't. It has to be satisfied by the private sector mainly. So this is not a cut on that. I think that the AIIB does have a rationale. The other thing that came out of APEC was a specific articulation of the American withdrawal from TPP. And it's ironic because TPP had been a fundamental aspect of the tilt toward Asia that President Obama had articulated. And so we found, the United States found itself in the position of being a total outsider at APEC. You had 11 nations come together without the United States, who not only were not the leader of the TPP, of the new organization, we're not even part of it. So I think that was a very clear message to the member states as well. I think that there was a shift toward discussion about military solutions in the region, much more openly than we'd seen in the past. Now, some obvious reasons for that, given the situation with North Korea. And in fact, yesterday, with the ICBM launch, you can understand that. But it had never been as articulated that much before in a kind of a regional trip like that. And this was the longest regional trip of any U.S. president since Bush 41. I think that the egotism of President Trump allowed Xi in China, to a lesser extent Abe here, Duterte in the Philippines, to in a sense play a kind of rope-a-dope, to use the Muhammad Ali phraseology, by bringing the United States out by virtue of the pomp and circumstances that appeals to President Trump's ego. And actually, for example, in China, very little was promised in return. If you recall, President Trump basically said that after saying for months and months and months, over a year, that China manipulated the bilateral trade relationship, goes to China and basically says, don't worry about that, it was always our fault, which was a great irony, I think, for a lot, and certainly a great irony for a lot of people in the business community who were visibly unhappy at APEC. As a former corporate CEO, I had some access with a lot of these folks, and I can tell you that in the corridors outside the meeting halls, there's a lot of unhappiness about the shift in blame for the trade issues, and also there was a deep concern by the business community that the Trump administration sees this as a win-loss proposition, when international trade really is not a win-loss proposition, especially the way manufacturing takes place today, which is global. So I think that was very clear. He did not receive tremendous amount of support in China on North Korea. We're probably going to have another Security Council meeting where they're going to try to ratchet up sanctions again, but there's not been a dramatic change on that. I'd say that at a minimum, we were able to get Trump to drop the Rocket Man rhetoric, which was not helpful at all. As it relates to North Korea, my big concern about North Korea, particularly because we have the tweeter-in-chief as President of the United States, and by the way, which is really harmful if you're representing your country outside, and you're representing the administration saying one set of things, and then 2 days later, it comes out, totally negates what you've been trying to argue. The credibility issues are dramatic in that case. At any rate, my concern with North Korea, and particularly with this president, is that the rhetoric on both sides could lead to miscalculation. And I think miscalculation is something that is a dangerous, dangerous thing in this age with nuclear weapons. Now, for President Kennedy, this was his biggest worry in the nuclear age. In fact, he instructed everyone in his cabinet to read a book called Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. And in that book, Barbara Tuchman argued that the main reason for the beginning of World War I was tremendous miscalculation, and the parties fell into conflict. So I think that's a big worry that I have in terms of the situation with North Korea. If I could move on a little bit further now to talk to apparently the big victory in the Trump administration's eyes as it related to Japan was the sale of military equipment. They put pressure on Japan to buy a lot more military equipment. I found that ironic because Japan is already a huge military customer of the United States. About the second biggest customer is Japan. I know a little bit about this because I was selling Japan weapons when I was in Boeing. And I can tell you that Japan has the largest fleet of F-15s in the world, next to the United States. So the idea of making military sales a major priority, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And on top of that, with Trump and Abe's visit, was pushing Japan to manufacture a lot more cars in the United States than it does in Japan. And Goto-san and I know this story, but obviously about 80 to 85% of Japanese cars manufactured are in the United States anyway. So it seemed a little bit of an offbeat recommendation. I think that Duterte effectively played President Trump. He even lullabied him when he was in, and it was very difficult for a lot of us with all of the human rights issues that exist in the Philippines, not only the Philippines, in Myanmar and several other places in the region. There was hardly any reference to the human rights issues that exist in the region. And I think that was a lost opportunity to tie some of those issues together. Now, I want to change gears now and talk about the situation with the American foreign policy establishment. All of these issues have been undermined by the talk in Washington, D.C. of tremendously undercutting the State Department's budget and even the personnel of the department. The proposal that's on the table is a 37% cut in the foreign policy budget in the State Department. This is deadly stuff, and it has also caused a lot of concern in the U.S. In the Senate. Republicans have expressed concern about this. Senator McCain has been very explicit on his worries as it relates to these cuts. So it's not only a Democrat issue, but it has wider implications. And one of the things that has caused a lot of concern in the Department of State, and by the way, I keep in very close touch with the Department of State. This is my retiree badge from the State Department, which allows me to go in and out of the building. So I talk to people there. But there seems to be, as you well know, the Secretary of State is also a former corporate CEO, came from Exxon. And he seems to have wanted to import a sort of corporate style of reorganization into the Department of State. Well, as someone who spent 14 years in the corporate world, it ain't going to work. The Department of State and the corporate world have very, very different goals. And to bring in, corporate style reorganization, which means cuts, payouts to people to encourage them to leave, it doesn't have legs. It's just not going to work. It's a very simple reason. These two organizations have very different objectives. The objective of the corporate world is to make money and expand markets. And the objective of the State Department is American national interest and diplomacy. And those are not the same. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the morale in the State Department has never been lower. I have been around the State Department for 40 years, since I was in Congress 40 plus years ago, and never seen it like this. And empty offices and nominees not going forward. I'll give you some examples of that. There are 72 senior posts, 72 that are simply left vacant. They're just vacant. Or have actings, which means career people who do not have the hooks and the links with the White House. So, and of those 72, there are no new nominees there. The Tillerson State Department, as I referenced, in an effort to reduce personnel, another 8% is offering, again, corporate-style buyouts of $25,000. If a diplomat walks in and says he wants to leave by April, he gets a $25,000 handout. That's what's happening. And this is very unusual. The concern about this, I guess I have it elsewhere. Concern about this is so deep in the American foreign policy establishment that the American Academy of Diplomacy and my organization, the Council of American Ambassadors, took the unusual step of sending a letter to congressional leadership opposing this. Now, the Academy, American Academy of Diplomacy, those are the career people, senior diplomats. Mine are the political appointees, but they don't always see eye to eye, the career guys and the non-career. Because the career guys look upon us political appointees as taking their senior ambassadorships away. That's essentially what they fear, and they're not wrong. But about 30% over 30% of U.S. ambassadors are not career diplomats. They're political appointees of the president. So this is a rare instance where the Academy and the Council are singing from the same page. We're both worried about this. And the Council, by the way, as an aside, the American Academy of Diplomacy is chaired by a distinguished, great, 7 times U.S. ambassador, diplomat by the name of Tom Pickering. And I helped this a little bit along. He was my boss at Boeing, too, so I'm very close to Tom. I'm very respectful. But he's a career 7-time ambassador. And so we worked together to try to get this letter out. One of the key passages in the letter that was sent to Capitol Hill was, we believe the proposed magnitude of the cuts to the State Department budget pose serious risks to American security. That's pretty tough language from these two groups to come out. So morale at the State Department, as I mentioned, just walking the halls is very low. Even, for example, I was talking to some people the other day, it's very important about a year before you have a new assignment in the Foreign Service to have an idea of where you're going. They're not going out with new assignments. They're just not going out with them. So people are sort of like, what am I going to do? So that is another driver for people who want to go away. And so you've got people at the most senior levels who are looking about walking, and you got the junior levels. And the challenge for this, especially in an area like Asia, where country expertise is so important and regional understanding is so important, the challenge is that it could take a generation to rebuild that talent. So it has definite effect on U.S. policy in the region. I mean, don't underestimate that. One little story. In the 1950s, during all of the turmoil with the McCarthy era and the Who Lost China crowd, remember the Who Lost China crowd? That was people saying that China was lost by the experts on China in the State Department, and they were wiped out. So in the 1950s and early 60s, we had no China hands. And there are many people in the foreign policy community who believe that it is one of the reasons why the United States missed the Sino-Soviet split. Missing the Sino-Soviet split helped us stay in Vietnam probably a lot longer because of that. So that's the stakes. Those are the stakes when you have this kind of dramatic personnel and budget cuts coming, and why I think this is so important for Asia. So those are my remarks, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Please do feel free to sit.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that very eloquent and sobering assessment. So we'll take questions now from the working press first. And since I'm also working press, maybe I could ask you a question very quickly, which is that President Trump was able to play the kind of North Korea card when he came here. Oversimplifying, in effect, he was able to say, yes, we've walked away from the TPP. We do have an America first policy, but you need us for defense, and especially with this North Korean crisis looming as it is. So how long do you think this kind of card can be played? I mean, do you think this will enable the US, despite President Trump's shortcomings, to go on saying, well, it doesn't really matter what I do in the economic sphere, you need us for defense, and therefore, you know, we are absolutely of primary importance?
Well, I think yesterday's development, by the way, potentially changes some of the basis. And that is with the launching of the ICBM to heights that is claimed to be capable of hitting, basically, according to Secretary Madison, anywhere in the world. At the same time, Kim Jong-un said that they have achieved their goal now. That was his comment. Now, that could be an opening. And anybody who says they know definitely what's going on with North Korea is kidding themselves. I mean, I think a lot of this is a guessing game. And we take our assessment based on dealing with other states, and that's probably not the best thing to do with North Korea, but it's all you have. And so it is possible with Un coming out, Kim Jong-un coming out and saying they have now reached their goal, that could be some sort of an avenue for some kind of discussion. I think the real key here, though, is to what extent that is open. And I'm going to come back to your military question because it's related. And that is simply this. If they say we're not going to proceed further with the nuclear program, and if the United States takes the position that it's going to require UN inspectors to verify this is not going to, the question is, does Trump take that bait or not? I'm not sure he would. I'm not sure he feels that that is something strong enough for his base. If that's the case, then all bets are off. Then we should continue down this road. My instinct is that Prime Minister Abe would probably be quite nervous about Trump taking that bait, because he would see this as maybe cutting Japan loose at one point, or having the potential to cut loose a little bit. Certainly the South Koreans would worry about that. So this is, again, where you have seasoned diplomats who would be important to try to understand where this is going and have some background on this. So the military angle is always going to be vital for Japan's interest. If it is not there, if the United States takes the position that causes Abe in any way to separate, then you may see more aggressive movements on toward Article 9 and a little bit more of an aggressive policy here in Japan. You might, if Japan doesn't feel its interests are being sufficiently covered by this. And part of the problem is you don't know with this administration. It's got a credibility issue.
Okay, questions from the working press, please. Yes, yes.
Siegfried Kittel, freelancer from Germany. About the reform of the foreign ministry, I think there were some articles, even in the New York Times or Washington Post, little bit sympathetic with Tillerson's reform of the foreign ministry, because they said the ministry is very inefficient, and it would be necessary to make some reform. And I think the article said also some former foreign minister tried to reform the foreign ministry. Even Hillary Clinton did it and gave it up. So could you explain, is there some necessary to change, or?
Every administration reforms the State Department. Every one of them. You never get the same State Department as you did when you came in. Obama, I was around for that one, right? Certainly Hillary, and that was the conjecture from Obama's policy and working that out with Hillary. So every administration changes. The question is the degree and the objectives. And this is where I think a lot of us have. No, our two organizations that I just mentioned, further down in that letter, you can, at the very last paragraph, you will see we are not opposed to reform in the State Department. It's not. Nobody is. But how it's done and what the objectives are and what kind, the extent to which those budget cuts are going to hit hard. 37% is a tremendous amount of a hit. So, and that's what a lot of people in the Senate are worried about. So I think directly, no one's opposed to reform. It's the way it's done and what the objectives are. Yeah.
Okay, next question, please. Sorry, oh, Peter, yes. It is Peter, I think. Yeah.
It's Peter Langer, Asia Times. I've got two questions, if I may. You alluded to Hillary briefly. Could you sort of expand upon, the mistakes made in the campaign, seeing as you were an insider? And for all the talk of Trump as a walking disaster, if you like, what are the Democrats doing in the United States to change that? I mean, what's really happening at the grassroots level for the next election? And secondly, about Tillerson, I believe the lady he brought in to do the reform has just quit. Yeah. So being an ex-CEO yourself, and he formerly at Exxon, have you had an opportunity, or other CEOs in similar positions as yourself, had an opportunity to talk to him? Because he seemingly denies that, well, he said publicly he doesn't hear or see the disarray at the State Department that is talked about. Is someone talking to him, such as yourself, to kind of make that clear, or who is really, pulling his strings? Thank you.
Excellent questions. Hillary's mistakes. I will tell you that that I was not a super insider in this particular campaign. I was with Obama. I was an Obama person from, well, I've known him since 2002, so I didn't have that inside the tent seat with Hillary. So I can only tell you some of the mistakes that I perceived as an outsider. Even, I raised money for her, and I was on the Asia policy team. But I can tell you also what I read. I read her book. She was quite explicit. And the book, came out. It's called What Happened? Fitting title. My exposure to it was very simple. I was campaigning in Pennsylvania with a group, and I was in an area that, and I'm not from Pennsylvania, I campaigned in several states. My home state is Florida, and we lost, and that was one of my territories. So, but I was struck in going through Pennsylvania in some areas that were normally pretty consistently blue, had massive Trump-Pence signs everywhere I went. And I was concerned about it, and I can remember calling the campaign and saying, I'm not an expert on the, on the grassroots door knocking, but this seems really strange to me. I never saw this, McCain versus Obama. I never saw that kind of thing. In fact, Obama signs were everywhere. And I was basically told, well, don't worry about it. We got it under control. Well, we lost Pennsylvania. And so that was my first exposure to that. And I think the other thing was I was struck by the size of the Hillary bureaucracy in the campaign. It wasn't that, I mean, there's so many people, and they were, you couldn't keep people's names straight, and Obama's group, we were pretty small, actually. I mean, we expanded, of course, as the campaign got underway. We expanded a lot, but I can remember when there was just a handful, but it never really got to be the same kind of bureaucracy that I saw with Hillary. Now, that's probably doesn't going to give you the overall explanation as to what happened. I think the book probably does as good a job on that as anything. Now, the Democrats, what are the Democrats doing to change this? That's a great question, and I'm hoping to find out a lot more next week when I'm in the U.S. I'm going to be in Washington as well. We were just talking about this earlier today. Anthony says, well, who do you got, who are you teeing up? We really don't know You know, no one with a straight face can actually tell you right now that they know who's going to be the Democratic Party nominee in the next election. Nobody knows. You got some names. There's a big, I think there's a pretty big, you know, tent filled with people who are potential. But even with Obama, you know, it was relatively late. I mean, he shined at the 2004 convention, which put him on the map as a potential. But, you know, in 2006, when I told a lot of people, I'm committing, 2006 was late 2006, I'm committing to Barack Obama. I cannot tell you how many people thought I was on drugs. They thought I was out of my mind. The United States is never going to elect a black man. Who are you thinking about? And so it can happen relatively late where things begin to jar. But I think the Democratic Party, if I can say one thing, and I'm a Democrat, of course, we need to do a better job of projecting forward. We can't only use Trump as the whipping boy. We have to project what we're going to do and what kind of alternatives that we as a party have for the American people. And if we're simply going to be going after Trump, I think over time that's not going to help us. So we're going to have to work on that. I have never met Tillerson myself. And I know that he doesn't have a warm and fuzzy relationship with the State Department folks. They've had a hard time connecting. Even their head of diplomatic security left. And the head of diplomatic security are the ones that guard the embassies. They're the ones that's where the RSO is, the regional security operations and whatnot. And if you don't have communication with your head of security for the embassies, you know, which is I find ironic coming from the other side, given that they had beat up so badly on Hillary over Benghazi, but they had no communication. And the guy wound up leaving, head of diplomatic security, just left a couple days ago. So I don't think they got anybody now except in acting. I assume that Secretary Tillerson does have his own corporate pals, and I have heard of some of them. And he's got some supporters, I know in Texas, the oil industry, who know him well and have confidence in him. But I don't know of anybody who's sitting down and talking to him who can, you know, who has the, I mean, I'm sure they're there, but I don't know anyone who really has that ability. And again, to me, the answer for the reform of the State Department doesn't rest in the corporate world. It rests in understanding what the institution is about and what the objectives are and what is the art of the possible and how does it work with Congress. It's not about, you know, bringing in corporate standards and whatnot. I mean, believe me, having worked on both sides, I know pretty well they're very different animals. Yep.
Okay, there's a hand. Sorry, are you working press? Yes, sorry, I can't see you right from here. Yes, of course. Sorry, please go.
Takashi Koyama, freelance. What kind of a State Department does President Trump want to build? You mentioned the word loose Japan. What do you mean by that?
What, Japan?
Lose. Lose Japan?
Yeah.
I don't think Trump wants to lose Japan.
No. What I meant by that was that I got the impression that give the Japanese more freedom.
I think what Trump is arguing with his America First policy is that he wants to focus relations with countries in the region, not through multilateral organizations, but focus more on the bilateral relationships. In the case of Japan, that has always been the case anyway, because of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So that, in a sense, that's not a real shift. Now, your first question was, what does Trump want to see in the State Department? And if anybody knows that answer, I recommend a Nobel Prize. Because I'm not sure that Trump knows what he wants in the State Department. I will say this, that he's gone on record as saying, when he's been asked about senior advice for foreign policy, he has publicly stated, I'm my own advisor, I'm the only one who counts. Well, I find that to be very self-defeating. And anybody who's been in politics or business or anything else knows that nobody's perfect, everyone's got flaws, and you need that kind of input. So I don't think we really know, nor do I think Trump knows what the State Department should look like. That's my response to that.
Okay. Yes, does it?
Hideki no Shitekyōdo News. Thank you, Skip.
Sure.
My question is a little bit hypothetical. Would it be possible for the United States to get back to TPP after 2020 if the President Trump was not re-elected? In the last year, the Bernie Sanders was dead set against TPP, and even the Secretary Clinton had shifted her position toward a little bit skeptical of the TPP. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kinoshita-san. I think that, first of all, in my view, Hillary's supposed opposition was mainly tactical maneuver. Because she was running against, let's face it, Bernie Sanders was Trump's perfect counterpart. He was a populist. And so the populist position, not the Republican position, I think it's very important that we differentiate there. The Republican, I think, would have supported TPP, a regular Republican. The Republican Party is not all that psyched about what many Republicans see as a drift toward some protectionism. I think the Republican Party is nervous about that. So I think that in the case of Hillary, she was, I think, a bit of tactic policy vis-a-vis Bernie Sanders, and I think had she won, there would have been some perhaps mechanical wording changes worked out with the other parties so that we would have had, I think the United States would have been a signatory at the end of the day. I think that the possibility of joining TPP should, well, in my case, should a Democrat win, I think it's high. And I don't think that the base, the American public, were that necessarily opposed to TPP at all. Well, first of all, most Americans don't know what it is. And secondly, it's an organization that had not even come into existence yet. NAFTA is different. NAFTA you can blame because it's already in existence, and even if the basis of that blame has no founding, still you can point a finger at it. TPP you couldn't. So I don't think it would be that difficult for the United States to turn around. Now, of course, with the 11 countries there, it'd be interesting to see how successful they are in rolling this out. And I'm hopeful that they are really successful in rolling this out and creating these regional standards.
Okay. Apparently, the decision was taken at APEC to call it the CPTPP
right.
from there, so we have to change our.
That's right. Comprehensive program, yeah, something.
Yoshio Murakami, I'm advisor in Japan for international edition of the New York Times. I'm wondering if the Trump's approach to Asia in his last trip, there was not much left to continue and enforce the American principles of freedom and human rights. It's beyond that stage already in a way that if he did not see, for instance, the Filipino president, the U.S. would have pushed him even further to China. And so I think the most he could do, I agree with you that he is not in that area of human rights, as you can see in his domestic attitudes and the way he was being criticized during the Virginia issue. But I think neither Abe, but both connived to do was to see the families of those kidnapped families by the North Koreans. So there was that aspect there. And I was wondering, what he has been trying to do is that President Obama's strategic patience has missed the point beyond which he would have to go to the more on the military side. So I think he's been asking the Congress to increase the budget for defense. And even, I think although you're saying that he's been proposing 37% cut for the State Department, do you think that will be the final decision? I think the Congress, I may dare to say, may settle down with even 10% that area. So he's not really, in my view, trying to cut the budget of the State Department. What do you think?
Well, I think that I think 37% is unlikely. Now, the question is, Trump had touted himself as being the great business negotiator during the campaign. Well, I haven't seen anything that enforces that with me. I think that Trump has been very, very easy to play by other countries, and that is by appealing to his remarkable ego. And I think Chinese did it very well. I think President Xi was very effective in basically not giving him anything. And I think that he has not, can anyone seriously say that Trump has been effective in negotiating with Capitol Hill? I spent a lot of time on the Hill, and we would have played rope-a-dope with him on the Hill for this. He has not been effective. He doesn't understand that kind of negotiation. So as far as the military spending is concerned, I think it's just, I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to his base. I don't think there's any there. I don't think there's any concept of going forward on what does it mean. I mean, you know, one of the things that General Mattis, then General Mattis, now Secretary Mattis, said that made total sense to me when he testified on Capitol Hill a couple of years ago, and they were talking about dramatic State Department cuts. His answer was, fine, cut the State Department, give me more weapons. I'm going to have to be fighting more wars. That's what he said, and he's the Secretary of Defense right now. And I think it's true. That's why, and the same thing with our foreign aid budget, which is being tremendously gutted. It plays an important role. The government of Japan sees, for example, economic development as a very important tool. Has for a long time. I once wrote a book about Japanese foreign aid, actually. So I don't trust where Trump is going with his strategic thinking on this. I don't see much strategy. And the other thing I might point out, take a look at the administration for a second. The role that senior military people have come to play in this administration is unprecedented. It looks like a junta. You know, I used to teach American presidential history. I tried, the last time we obviously had General Marshall, who at the end of the war became the first Secretary of Defense. And we see a scattering of them, but you don't see it as strongly as you do today. And the irony is that it appears that the military people are the doves, not the hawks. And that's truly unprecedented in my view. So those are my observations.
Good point. Sorry, you had your hand raised, so don't.
Hello, I'm Kazuo Nagata of Yomiuri Shimbun. I want to discuss a bit about Southeast Asia. Of course, last week Secretary Tillerson condemned Myanmar by using the term ethnic cleansing. But so, as you mentioned, there are many other human rights concerns in that region, and Cambodia and Thailand is still under the military rule, and so on and so on. But there's always concern, also against the background of this the rising China. So there's always concern those if the U.S. sanctions those Southeast Asian countries, they can always move back closer to the China. So what do you think is this administration's calculation in this game in this China? Yes.
I don't think they have a calculation. Yeah. I mean, we heard, I think Secretary Tillerson correctly came out to discuss the situation with the Rohingya, which you're not supposed to say. But do we seriously know if President Trump feels the same way? Depends upon what tweet you receive the following day. We have no idea whether that's the president's policy or not. We just don't. So, I think it's a big question mark. Now, as it relates to, say, further sanctions on Myanmar, and by the way, when I was ambassador to the ADB, I was ambassador when we opened up to Myanmar. But still, until the end of my term, I could not use the word Myanmar publicly. It had to be Burma. Still. Now, I don't know whether it's changed yet, but up until last year, it was still Burma for me. I think there's one important thing that we learned in the opening to Myanmar. As you remember, the big problem and the big rift between China and Myanmar occurred over the development of dams in northern Myanmar. And the view among the Myanmarese was that the Chinese had moved too fast and too furiously, if I can coin the term. Then this opening developed, and I can remember talking to Secretary, I remember this was November of 2011, I think it was, and I remember sitting next to Secretary Clinton and asking her what's going to happen. And then she turned to me and she said, well, Mr. Ambassador, the President has told me to go to Burma tonight. So I felt like I was there at history, so I could go back to the ADB and tell the President, well, I spoke to the Secretary today, But one of the things that I cautioned businesses, and I cautioned the U.S. government, and I would say the same thing right now, do not believe that if there's a break in relation with China for Myanmar, that they want to run into the hands of the Japanese and the Americans and let, in a sense, them take over the show. Nothing could be further from the truth. My view has been always that the people in Southeast Asia, not just Myanmar, strive for balance. They don't want the Americans and they don't want the Japanese to run the show. They want balance. And so if one side kicks up a little bit too stronger on one end, they're going to reach out to the other players on the other, either way. So I'm not really concerned if there was anything. I don't believe that. I think that Myanmar would go over to the Chinese as a tactical maneuver, more than some sort of a grander plan. Southeast Asia, and I was, just 2 weeks ago, not only was I in Vietnam, but I was in Laos and I was in Thailand, and I spoke to government officials throughout the region, and that's pretty consistent.
I think we've got time for just one more question. Sorry, you've already had a question. Yes, you. Yes.
Thanks for taking my question. Alistair Gale, I'm with the Wall Street Journal. What would a Hillary Clinton North Korea policy look like if she'd won the election? I mean, beyond the rhetoric of President Trump, essentially the policy seems to be pressure the North Koreans to a point where they'll come to the table to talk about denuclearization, which is the policy, or which was the policy more or less of the previous US administration. So now that things have accelerated with the North Korean nuclear program and missiles, would the Clinton approach, other than perhaps not quite the level of threats and rhetoric that we're getting from President Trump, would it have been that different?
That's a great question. First of all, you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which Hillary is more hawkish than a lot of Democrats. She's taken some pretty strong stands. I mean, even within the Obama White House, she would often be the hawk in the room. So I think she'd be pretty tough. I definitely believe you would not hear the Rocket Man rhetoric coming out of her. I think she would be much more guarded about the language. I don't think she would be as likely to deploy aircraft carriers in the Sea of Japan and things like that. I think it would be much more guarded by that. But I think she would be very aggressive, further aggressive on the sanctions. And we can argue right now until we're blue the extent to which those sanctions are even effective. And I also think that she would probably work the Chinese without the fear of being, I would not fear that she would be played by the Chinese. I think Hillary is very clever. And she wouldn't have to have, she wouldn't require pomp and circumstances to make her feel good about Xi. She wouldn't do that, period. So that would be, I think, lead to a very different discussion between the Chinese and the United States, because China, no matter what we say, what we think, is going to have to be part of this answer. It won't work without China. But they're playing us as well, too. I mean, they're on both, not just toward Trump. So that's my answer. I mean, I think she'd still be hanging in there. You just wouldn't see the rhetoric. Be a little more subtle.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we've overrun time by a few minutes, so just remains for me to thank you very much for that informed insider's analysis. You live in Kamakura, which is not very far away, so please use this one-year honorary membership and come back and talk to us again. Thank you very much.
Glad to have that. Thanks, Anthony.